Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. So the COVID group representing bereaved families has called for Boris Johnson to lose all public privileges like his pension, the money he gets to run his office, everything. Do you agree? Well, before you answer, listen to this, because it may well be that Boris Johnson should really be going to prison. There's evidence he's committed perjury. But first, let's go over the background to this. So back in February 2020, we'd just left the EU, but we were also seeing reports of a deadly virus sweeping the world. This is not something Boris Johnson suggested we should take seriously. However, we now know from the COVID inquiry that experts in the UK were taking it very seriously and urging the government to do likewise. But they didn't. In February 2020, the NHS feared being overwhelmed. It was starting to get really serious. We had not at that point had a death in this country yet, but the virus was spreading. How did Boris Johnson respond to this alarm from our healthcare system? Up until now, we thought by doing nothing. Turns out it was worse than that. He actually went on holiday. All the calls for leadership from the government got a bit too much for Boris Johnson to handle, and he decided he needed a break. This was after already taking holidays the month before, while the country was facing flood-related emergencies, remember. So if you hear anyone trying to claim that Boris Johnson tried his best, you tell them bollocks from me. So what are the details of this latest scandal, and how has he committed perjury? Well, the most damning report to be published by the COVID inquiry yet was released last Friday. I discussed some of it during the stream that day. The report focused heavily on the response of the various governments during the initial build-up and through the first two waves. The inquiry did not conclude that Boris Johnson did his best. In fact, reading through the report, you could conclude that we may have been better off with Liz Truss in charge at the time. I remind people that COVID is a SARS-based virus and that we dealt with SARS nearly 20 years earlier. Do people remember the early noughties? Labour were in charge and they carried out fever checks at airports. They were advising people across the country of the risks and mitigations. When COVID reared its head, we should have been taking at the very least those same precautions. As I've explained for years, Britain was in a decent position to avoid the worst of COVID. We're an island, so we've got a much easier time managing people coming into the country. Remaining part of the single market was not a factor, because even Schengen countries, where there's proper freedom of movement on the continent, were still closing their borders, because freedom of movement can legally be suspended for emergencies, and it was. So a prime minister who'd spent years banging on about borders decided to leave ours wide open at a time where he should have actually been applying restrictions and checks and was able to do so legally. Next, we were hit much later than most other advanced economies. We had more warning and could also learn lessons from countries hit first. We ignored the warnings and learned nothing. Third, both the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer were both experts specifically in infectious diseases. Boris Johnson had experts on hand and ignored them. Throughout 2020, he insisted he followed the science, but that the science was often unsure, so of course mistakes were being made. Anyone with a scientific background, even as basic as my own, knew that this wasn't true of some of the more obvious precautions to take. But the COVID inquiry evidence made clear that the science was not being followed. It was being beaten with bats, tied up with rope and dumped in the cellar. Oh, and while you're dumping the experts into the cellar, bring us up another crate of wine, Johnson would say. The end result was that we had a pretty much the worst response of any advanced economy, despite having more warning. I think only America really under Trump gave us a run for our money. I suppose we should be grateful that Johnson didn't suggest curing COVID by snorting or injecting bleach. But this latest revelation that Johnson actually pissed off on a 4-day holiday at just the time it was becoming obvious that the shit was about to hit the fan is unforgivable, which is a word the head of the inquiry used about Johnson's general response to the virus as it progressed through 2020. And what's really remarkable here is that Boris Johnson specifically testified that he'd worked throughout that period. So according to the official logs of his activities, it would appear that Boris Johnson lied under oath. In fact, according to the Guardian article on the matter, there is a full 10-day period in late February which fails to show that Johnson was working on anything related to the COVID response. And the activities of the Prime Minister are logged in detail for the official records. So in that crucial 10-day period, the record shows that Boris Johnson spent 4 of them walking his dog, riding motorbike, entertaining guests for dinner parties, whilst doing no government work at all. So that's a holiday. And there were another 6 days in that period where he may have been carrying out work, but not on anything related to the pandemic. A 10-day period at a time when the NHS was getting very worried, when the Prime Minister just removed himself from the issue completely. Tried his best, my arse. As we know from the report, this is because Boris Johnson was content for Dominic Cummings to be running the government. Now, we might not have minded if Cummings were competent, but he ran number 10 with a deliberate culture of fear, bigotry and chaos, as described in the report. The can't-be-arsed Prime Minister putting the village idiot in charge. It's worth noting that Cummings himself did not take kindly to the way this latest report characterised him, but I don't think anybody cares. Now, let us remind ourselves of what Baroness Hallett-Casey, the head of the inquiry, said in her video message last week. She said she would describe the UK's response to the pandemic as too little, too late. And although the report highlighted an absolute litany of specific errors and failures, it can perhaps be explained more generally by noting that at just the time the government should have realised there's no more time for delay, we've now got to act, Boris Johnson spent a full 10 days carrying out 0 duties at all on COVID issues, providing 0 leadership. He spent 4 of them on holiday away from Downing Street altogether. In other words, we had a crucial 10-day period when the NHS were worried about being overwhelmed, when the Prime Minister was completely absent from the process. 10 days when Johnson ignored the pandemic as if it didn't exist. The inquiry made clear that his inaction cost an additional 23,000 lives just in the first wave alone. And that was just from not locking down a week earlier, which would have been still in March. It doesn't even include how many more lives would have been lost as a result of not acting in February, because that's too difficult to calculate, I guess. Now, we can't actually put former Prime Ministers in prison for not giving a shit. The public kind of have to take responsibility for letting him be in charge in the first place. Tory MPs need to take responsibility for not supervising him more closely when they knew he was a work-shy shitter. But perjury is a criminal offence, in a way being shit at Prime Minister isn't. I see no reason why Boris Johnson should not be investigated for perjury here. What is the point in swearing an oath when giving evidence if the most famous liar in the country can tell such brazen lies, ones where he must have known the written record would call him out on it, and expect to get away with it? Maybe the bereaved families group should call for legal consequences. I doubt anyone can actually stop Johnson's payments and pensions without looking at it, without it looking political. But it's the police and judiciary who should be dealing with perjury, not politicians. Nothing political about it. Get him in the dock, see how he likes those prisons he allowed to become so overcrowded. No early release, though. Do you think he should be investigated for perjury? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel for more content. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'll see you later.